So in this video, we're going to talk about thin subwoofers, and we're going to talk about mistakes that people make and problems that people encounter when they try to use a thin subwoofer. Let's take a look at this cool 10-inch subwoofer here that NVX sent me, and then we'll build an enclosure for it, and I'll show you some of those mistakes. This is the SMW10D4 10-inch 350 watt shallow mount subwoofer. The first thing that really jumped out at me when I opened it up was this big dust cap here that appears to be carbon fiber. There's something else in the packaging that I'll show you a little bit later in the video. This subwoofer ships with a really cool accessory. One thing interesting here that I think is kind of cool is there's a little bit of shrink wrap on the tensile leads before the tensile leads get woven into the spider. There also appears to be some kind of venting on the back of the cone underneath the dust cap. There's no pole vent on the back, and that's good because you don't have to worry about the clearance on the back. This is a thin subwoofer after all, and the goal of course is to make the subwoofer fit into tight spots. It's a dual 4-ohm voice coil. It has 8 millimeters of X-Max. Now that 8 millimeters of X-Max is kind of a blessing and a curse. You don't want a lot of X-Max if you're trying to cram a subwoofer into a tight spot, but you need X-Max in order to get loud and get low. Now of course it is a thin subwoofer, and you buy thin subwoofers so that you can mount them in tight spots. The mounting depth on this thing is 3.23 inches. And I'm going to build an enclosure for this thin subwoofer, and I want to talk just in general terms about the pros and cons of thin subwoofers, when you should consider using them and when you should not consider using them. So here I am working on the enclosure. My goal for this enclosure is to simply make the smallest enclosure that I can physically fit the driver into, just to give you an example of how compact this thing can actually be. Because typically we see these thin subwoofers behind the seat in a small sports car or behind the seat in a regular cab pickup truck. And we typically have the seats leaned back a little bit so there's more room on the bottom than there is on the top. So this box is going to be 3 inches deep on the bottom and 2 inches deep on the top. So the overall bottom is going to be 3 inches plus the 2 pieces of MDF, so 4.5 inches. And the top is going to be 2 inches plus the MDF. In order to make the angled cuts, I'm going to go ahead and cut the side pieces and the top and the bottom slightly oversized, and then set them down on a flat surface and do a little bit of measuring. What I'm going to do here is measure 2 3/4 inches from the back of the enclosure and make a mark, and then go to the other side and measure 3 3/4 inches from the bottom of the enclosure, and then just draw a line connecting those 2 points. And my goal here is to now cut along that line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the top and the bottom. I'm going to take those over to the table saw, and I'm going to use my angle gauge just to roughly get an idea of the angle that I have here.
It looks to be about 17 degrees here in this case. 90 degrees minus 17 is about 73. Now it's just a matter of lining up the saw with the mark, making the cut, and hoping that it works.
Now the side of the enclosure is going to take a little bit more work. The challenge here is to make a safe and accurate cut on the table saw. To do that, I'm going to grab a piece of scrap and create a makeshift jig on the table saw. Now I take my template tape and tape the sides to this makeshift jig and carefully run the entire thing through the saw, and it should give me a perfect cut. If you've been watching my videos, you probably noticed that I've upgraded my table saw. The only reason why I'm able to afford these neat tools so that I can build things for you is because of my patrons over on Patreon. And I want to say thank you to everyone who joined me on Patreon. My $10 patrons are scrolling above the screen right here, and I always want to give a special shout out to my $25 patrons: Bo, David T, Doug, Dylan, Baba, and Stereolab LLC. Now it's just a matter of taking everything over to the workbench and seeing if it all lines up the way I expect it to. I'm a big believer in dry fitting and mocking things up prior to assembly, just to make sure everything fits and has been cut correctly. Always a good idea to mark all your pieces at this point so that you know they're going together correct when you actually start gluing things together, because nothing sucks worse than gluing half your subwoofer box together and then realizing that you've got the pieces in the wrong angle or the wrong orientation. And as I'm mocking it up, I see a little bit of a problem. Let me grab a flashlight and see if you can see what's going on here. The back of the subwoofer is hitting the back of the enclosure. The enclosure is too shallow for this shallow mount subwoofer. And that is the first mistake that people make when they try to build a shallow mount subwoofer enclosure. They build the enclosure too thin so the subwoofer doesn't fit. The subwoofer is not sitting flush in the box. We don't have enough clearance. So what do we do about that? If you remember when I was unboxing, I said there's a special piece. This is that special piece right here. It comes with this nice metal back plate. The idea behind this back plate is pretty simple. If you've built an enclosure that's too thin, you just cut a hole in the back of your enclosure, throw down some gasket material and stick this back plate on. So in this case where I've made the box too thin, I've got a really simple fix for it. I just grab my router, cut out a hole in the back, and then screw on this plate. Then I'm going to take my big rabbiting bit and make a little groove so this thing sits flush. Clearance problems go away and you can cram this subwoofer into a really tight spot. So just to give you an idea of how tight a spot you can squeeze this thing into, if the mounting depth is 3.23 inches, which is basically 3¼ inches, and if your front and back of the box are 3/4 inch MDF, well, that's 1.5 inches, you can fit this thing into 1 3/4 inch deep enclosure. So it's really cool that NVX included this piece because that solves mistake or problem number one. Let's take a closer look at the box that I've built. My goal here was to simply build an enclosure that is just as small as I could possibly make it to show you just how tiny of a space you can fit one of these thin subwoofers. The box itself is 12.5 inches wide by 12.5 inches tall. So why did I go with 12.5 by 12.5? Simple. I had scrap pieces left over from another build that I did that I'll give you a link to up here. Because this box was just built to prove a point. And that point is, of course, you can get one of these thin subwoofers and cram them into a really, really small box. And that is the next mistake people make whenever they are installing a thin subwoofer. It turns out that most thin subwoofers, even though they can fit into a small box, probably shouldn't fit into a small box. For example, according to the owner's manual, NVX recommends that if you use a sealed box, you should go with 0.75 cubic feet. And if you go with a ported enclosure, you need to go with 1.25 cubic feet. I don't know what the airspace is in this little box, but if it's roughly 1 foot by 1 foot by about 2.5 inches, it's nowhere near that size. And that is the other big mistake that people make when they go with a thin subwoofer. They don't make the enclosure large enough. To give you an idea, here is an enclosure that I built last year for a regular size subwoofer. This thing just happens to be tuned to the exact tuning frequency that NVX recommends, and it just happens to be the exact enclosure size that NVX recommends. And as you can see, the box is huge. Now I know when I say that, someone is going to jump into the comments and say something negative about this NVX subwoofer. But if you take the time to read the specs for pretty much every shallow mount subwoofer on the market, you will find that virtually all of them have the same problem. It's simply a matter of physics. There's this thing called Hoffman's iron law. It simply takes space to make bass. How do you get the most out of this subwoofer while taking advantage of its thin mounting depth? Because if you have the space for this enclosure here, you're not going to go with a thin subwoofer. I tackle this problem the same way I tackle every other problem, and that is I jump into something like WinISD, and I start looking at what happens to the frequency response, the port airspeed velocity, and the cone excursion as I try out different tuning frequencies and box sizes. And then of course I like to pull up SketchUp for drawing out plans, or at the very least getting a rough idea of what I want to accomplish. And I'm going to build that enclosure in the next video. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. I'm Justin, the DIY audio guy, and I will see you on the next adventure.